Welcome to the Muslim Street. This is our weekly edition of the Muslim Street podcast. We will be discussing some hot topics as usual, and you can also find us at www.themuslimstreet.com across all platforms at the Muslim Street, Facebook. We're on X at the Muslim Street, as well as YouTube. Please like and share, and we can scale our very what we think is a timely message from all points of the Muslim street around the globe. I'll be joined in a bit by our co-host Hina Lotus as we discuss some very hot topics. What we're discussing tonight is the failure of democratic power politics. That is not to say the Democratic Party. It is to say the democratic power politics as a failure, as a tool for oppressed people in a capitalist structure to seek any type of liberation or independence or even a buy-in into the existing empire. So we're going to be discussing that. I'm Malik Aziz, the co-host of the Muslim Street, founder of the MuslimStreet.com. As well as the curator of all of the particular social media structures. In addition to that, we're brought to you by the Lance Scurv Show. You can find him also on YouTube and across all social media. Lance Scurv, who is our engineer, is producing the show out of somewhere out of Accra, Ghana. So essentially, we will continue to build our infrastructure. We were going to a very hard launch mid-January. That is further notice. You will get that notice to come out. Essentially, we will go very hard across all of the platforms. We're in a soft launch stage. And again, tonight we'll be discussing over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so the failure of democratic power politics. So in this commentary, if we look at oppressed people inside of the empire that we know as America and the West, be it America as an example, and you can also point to the European creation of the concept of the nation state. Whenever there are oppressed people who have been pillaged inside of that construct, once they see any kind of leeway or breath of freedom, they think they can attain it through the infrastructure set up by the very people whom oppressed them. Meaning the irony there is that I oppressed you, and then I'm going to give you a vehicle to oppress me. That just doesn't happen. It's happened nowhere in the history of oppression where we have seen the oppressor provide a vehicle for the oppressed to overthrow their empire and replace them at the top. It just doesn't work that way. So if I were going to use America as a case study, the most oppressed people historically in this country are African people. African people who were brought against their will to this country on the bottom of ships in order to feed a capitalist structure. It was known as the European slave trade. It was a triangle of moving commodity and free labor from the African continent to the North and South America in order to produce goods. Those goods were cotton, those goods were tobacco, those goods were sugar, as an example, and then export those goods back to Europe. All right. So the Europeans come down to Africa and starting with the Portuguese, and they enslave African people to start this triangle. But this triangle, even though the multitude, as it looks from the outside, may look as though it was strictly based on color, actually, it was based on capitalism. It fed the capitalist structure. It built up not only the West in general, but South America prospered. and it's not an accident that post-slavery, after 310 years of free labor, shortly they gather again, the same entities, in 1884 at the Berlin Conference to reinstate their control over their capitalist structures through what was called colonialism. So slavery ends, colonialism starts. And here in the United States, 310 years of free labor. Imagine that you set out to build an independent country away from your oppressors, the English, right? And you settle here in North America, in the United States, and you're able to have free labor for 3 centuries in order to build your framework. I would say you're off to a pretty good start. In fact, it becomes the basis of the capitalist empire, right? If you want to know why America has the tallest buildings, you want to know why America has all these beautiful malls and streets and infrastructure, is because they got a head start of 310 years of free labor inside of that capitalist institution. Without it, America is no different than what you see in Guatemala and what you might see in Venezuela or in Nicaragua, or any other banana republic. Make no bones about it. It was free labor. So in the mid 1860s, the United States abolishes slavery through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And essentially, it is the 15th Amendment that allows the people to go to the polls. It ushered in a period of Black power politics, where we had Black governors in the southern states. We also had senators, United States senators, both on the state level as well as the federal level. And then this period of Reconstruction is ushered in, and all of that comes to an end during what was called the Southern Compromise. So, and this is where the federal government pulled out their military support of Black life in the South in regards to them getting handed over the presidency over the Rutherford B. Hayes Tilden issue. Now, I say all this to say, they never asked the people whom they oppressed for over 310 years, for over 3 centuries, upon them, quote unquote, freeing the slaves, did they want to be citizens of the United States? They just told them. And even giving them an option, right? So in this telling them that they were now citizens of the United States, after Reconstruction fell, they moved into a period of what we know as Jim Crow. Virtual oppression again of the African people of over 300 years who had suffered under a system of free labor to even have any kind of franchise in the United States. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, 100 years ago. Prior to that, women had no franchise or agency in the sands of the United States. It's only white men. So they're off to a very firm and fast start in solidifying infrastructure, sort of the Federal Reserve, infrastructure, sort of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, infrastructure, sort of the Department of Education and Department of Transportation. All of this, they're off to a fast start. So this brings us to the point that I want to really bring Hina Lotus in to kind of discuss as I give the meat to what I maintain is the failure of democratic power politics. After Dr. King and the civil rights movement struggled very hard for a passage of 2 bills, one in 1964, the Voters' Right Act, and then in 1965, the Civil Rights Act. This comes on the heels of what was passed next, and that was the Immigration Act of 1966. The Immigration Act of 1966 sort of plateaus, something that was agreed upon in 1926 when the United States government signed a bill that put a restriction on immigration, primarily from anywhere else in the United States, where we saw a decrease of immigration coming from outside of this country of 97%. 40 years later, in 1966, and I mention this only because it becomes relevant as we talk about the Muslim vote in the latter part of the 20th century and moving into the Bush years. And I'll speak on that, about some ironies around that. So the Voters' Rights Act of 1964, we saw Black people, grapple over this issue of how do we use politics. We had some very strong militant political leaders like Adam Clayton Powell Jr. We also, who came out of Harlem and New York, and he was very he created this whole concept, not the term, but the concept of Black power. And essentially, it is leaders like this that affected Malcolm X, as he called for 1964, in that election that was coming up, that this would be the year of the ballot or the bullet, right? So as we move further, and this is where this gets tricky. The oppressed people, the most oppressed people in the United States, African people, and we have to agree on that. They emerge out of Jim Crow in this country, and they began in the late 1960s to create, mid to late 1960s, to create the Black Power movement. Out of the Black Power movement, they began to talk about independent politics, away from the structures of white supremacy. And in 1972, over 10,000 delegates gathered in Gary, Indiana. And it was in Gary, Indiana, under the leadership of the newly elected mayor, Mayor Richard Hatchett, that 10,000 delegates met for over 3 days and put together a literally independent Black political party. Now, we might say, well, what happened to it, right? This essentially what happened to it is that the Black petty bourgeoisie, who had infiltrated the independent Black political party, led by Reverend Jesse Jackson, who came in with all the slogans like it's nation time, holding up the Black Power fist. He meant none of that. Sold the independent Black political movement to the Democratic Party, right? So by 1984, he himself launches a run as not an independent Black political figure, but a Democrat, and he launches a run for the presidency of the United States. By this time, it's solidified. And from that point that we see Black people firmly inside of the Democratic Party and where they remain today. The failure comes in the same period during the late 1970s and throughout the 80s and also the early 90s. Black Democratic leadership and Black political leaders had taken charge of every major tier 1 and tier 2 city in the United States politically. Chicago, we had in Chicago Mayor Harold Washington in 1983. Prior to that, in the late 1970s, in Cleveland, Ohio, Richard Stokes. Detroit, Mayor Coleman. We had in Philadelphia in 1983, 84, Wilson Good. New York, David Dinkins. You go out to Los Angeles, Mayor Tom Bradley. These are all major cities in the United States. New Orleans, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Houston, Dallas, all manned by Black political leadership. But the masses of Black people made no progress. They were over the budgets of all of the major cities in the United States, and Black people inside of the context of democratic power politics failed. And if you look at any of those cities, we saw the resurgence of drugs. It was heroin in the 1960s that was imported by the United States government, laissez-faire. And then as we moved to the mid to late 80s and throughout the 90s, crack cocaine. And then we have the infrastructure and the rise of racist Democrats, people like Joe Biden, who was the architect of the 1994 crime bill, which the black petty bourgeoisie, some of them, played ball with. Go look at the voting record of the Congressional Black Caucus vis-a-vis that 1994 crime bill that Joe Biden executed and architect, passed by the Clinton administration, that literally put a generation of black people in jail, in prison. Some of them are still there, right? So the main point that I will bring to the Muslim community, and we'll close out here, Hina, and we'll bring you on for comment, is that during the 1966 Immigration Act, this opened up the avenue for Muslim refugees and also others who were Muslims but not refugees to migrate to the United States. So we saw Palestinians come. We saw the second wave of Arabs, the first wave being in the 1920s. They were Lebanese Christians, right? Another story there, and I have to mention this before I go into 1966, is that in the 1920s and 1930s, the Lebanese come. They are petitioning the United States government to classify them as white. White is a racial construct set up by the empire, and they're successful. With them being successful, it brings up an issue because the United States then says that all Arabs, whether they come from the Middle East or North Africa being as west as Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, which is which houses the Nubians who built the original pyramids. They too, when they migrate to the United States in 2024, have to classify themselves, Sudan, have to classify themselves as Caucasian, in that they are Arabs, right? So this is some of the fallout. But going back to the last thing I'll say is that we see an influx into the United States from Muslim countries in the 1980s, in the 1990s. They are voting Republican by large. They're voting Republican. It was Samuel Arian, who later became under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, put on the terror watch list and deported from this country. A professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida. He was at Bush's White House. He was the connection for the Republican Party to the Muslim community, the immigrant Muslim community in the United States. And then 9/11 happened, and then he became persona non grata, right? And then there was a major shift from upwards to the mid 80 percentile of Muslims, primarily immigrant Muslims, voting Republican, and then in 9/11 happens, and then they shift because of the oppression of the Republican Party, hunting down every Muslim that they could find here and abroad for the next decade or so. They become Democrats, and they are that today, right? So that's the fire starter. Those are the talking points. I hope that I kind of grazed over history to kind of create a conversation, and also some thoughts in the minds of the listeners that there's some contradictions that we need to face, and there's some ironies that we need to have some open discussion, honest discussions about. Again, this is Malik Aziz on the Muslim Street podcast. You can find us at www.muslimstreet.com. You can also find us across all social media platforms at the Muslim Street. We're produced and brought to you by the Lance Scurv Show. And again, Hina, what do you think about the fire starter?
I mean, I think you summarized a really, really big portion of like the history of voting rights in the United States. And I think it's important to tie it back into the Muslim community and honestly minorities at large. One thing that I think the Muslim community and all minority communities need to understand is whatever voting rights have been given to us, which came much, much later on in American history, was to, of course, serve the empire, serve the capitalist system, serve all the systems that are basically built to oppress us. So that's the irony of all of it. Whenever we have been given any sort of freedoms per se, they haven't been to free us. They've just been, to further like the amount of people, the amount of labor per se that's like active within the economy, the amount of people that are able to sway like, the political parties. It's basically to manpower the same system that is then further used to subjugate us. Because whenever we are voting, we're basically helping people come into power whose entire objective is to take advantage of us and make sure that we are not privy to that information and don't have any sort of like rights or ability to dismantle the system. If anything, I think with the state sponsored media, which we're very proud to not be part of as independent journalism, but state sponsored media always makes it seem like the voting rights and our votes are done in such a way where it further liberates us or helps us, preserve our freedoms per se. So I think it's important to separate ourselves from the system entirely and completely understand that the only way to liberate ourselves is not to fall for, whatever state sponsored media is saying or to look at history and say, well, this was a win for us. I think it's to think creatively outside of the box.
Yeah. Now, what do you say to the individual who feels that their only voice is to use the vote to vote for whoever they feel will possibly relieve some of their concerns? And these are the people whom this is the only thing they have in their consciousness, in their activity, that once every 2 years or once every 4 years, I have the right to vote. Yeah, and they will hawk that point, and they will hawk it so that, what do you mean you don't vote? Our ancestors died for the right to vote. What do you mean you're not going to vote for the Democrat? That other one, Republicans are racist. This whole bubble? What do you say to people who are inside of that bubble?
I mean, you have to take a look at it this way, right? Whenever we are given the opportunity to vote, we are basically given the option choosing between two guns, and we're going to die either way, right? They may be entirely two different guns, but either way, the end result is the same. One gun might be prettier, one might be, a little quicker or older, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, the end result is the same. And so, if we're going to get the same results, regardless of which party we vote for, we need to understand and come up with like creative solutions as to how we function outside of the system. The system is only going to give us options to further subjugate us. And I think as Muslims, to create a third party, or not even a third party, an entire movement independent of the system altogether is imperative for us. Because I think, especially within the last, 20 to 30 years, you've seen this increase in Islamophobia. You've seen this increase in, hate crimes against us. You've seen policy after policy, which is hurting us not just in terms of foreign policy and what we see going on geopolitically with our own, taxpayer money, but we see it going on a domestic level as well.
The the big question here for the Muslims we see were in the last election on the national level was faced with a quandrum, right? Do we? This is the Muslims asking themselves a question. We have a sitting president and vice president who are funding, literally funding, a genocide of a Muslim nation in Palestine. There were some reports recently that there are more amputees in Gaza than in a history of wars in the world. Another statistic I read just yesterday, that there's 20,000 babies, 20,000 children underneath the rubble in Gaza, not yet counted. The Muslims in the last election were firmly behind their irritation and spite toward the Biden and Harris administration. And as soon as Joe Biden is forced out prior to the Democratic National Convention, then a large part of the Muslim community began to fight within each other, and some of them moved over to a large number of them moved over to the Kamala Harris campaign with the excuse that, well, she doesn't make any decisions. That's not her. She's not anything to do with that. She's going to be different. She'd be more easy to talk to than Trump. What do you say to that whole commentary?
I think the problem is a lot of people are falling for really good PR. I think a lot of people are falling for like maybe, certain candidates or individuals might be a little bit more diplomatic. They might be a little bit more, using like flowery terms. And I think that's on purpose. It's basically to entice like, certain parts of the population per se. But just because someone says the same message in a nicer way doesn't change the end result. And I think that's something that the Muslim community is really like waking up to, because just as we saw with like, the previous like election, we saw Kamala Harris and Biden basically in a very nice way say, hey, we're going to continue the war, right? And we're going to continue to, fund this genocide and do whatever we need to support Israel. But maybe we'll think about a ceasefire. Maybe, probably not though, right? And then I think the Republican Party is just very straight up like, hey, this is what we're going to do and you just have to deal with it. And I think that 1% chance that the Democratic Party may potentially be good on the, quote unquote ceasefire is what I think enticed a lot of people to vote for Harris. You can't look at what these individuals say. You have to look at what they're doing, right? And I think that's the problem. You can't fall for the language, because if the language is not matching the actions is the end result. We're looking for actions. And so I think we see that time and time again. You also saw that with Obama. Obama was, super educated, really well-spoken, really eloquent. People really looked up to a lot of things he said. I myself wanted to love him. He was just so well-spoken. But at the end of the day, when we saw his actions and what occurred in, a multitude of countries, including, how he dismantled Libya, we saw that his words did not match his actions. Not only was there not any change, but I think he like furthered that, neoliberal, goal to basically like dismantle, the global South, especially the Muslim world, and keep the U.S. in like a very dominant power in the colonial world.
Yeah. I'd like to bring up the case in the context of this conversation. And we're here on the Muslim Street. You can find us at themuslimstreet.com. We're discussing the failure of democratic power politics in the context of oppressed people seeking their liberation. I'd like to bring up the case of the chairman of an organization by the name of Uhuru. His name is Omali Yeshitela. Omali Yeshitela has spent the better part of 50 years, 60 years, struggling hard for the liberation of African people and oppressed people all over the world. He's the author of his seminal piece called Equilibrium. You should go to Amazon and order that book. It's a framework for political consciousness and political theory. Omali Yeshitela, who during the Biden administration took a trip to Russia. The United States government is at war, a proxy war through Ukraine with Russia during this period of time. And so he goes. He goes there. He's invited to speak. He makes some visitations to different organizations. And on his return, his entire organization and his leadership was raided by Joe Biden's FBI. His home raided in the wee hours of the morning with flashbang grenades. His headquarters down in St. Petersburg, Florida, his home in Kansas City, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, raided simultaneously. He's brought up on charges and then took to trial, and he's later convicted of conspiring to act as an illegal agent of the Russian government. Under the Biden administration, can you imagine the hypocrisy of what I just said? Here's a man, Omali Yeshitela, who represents oppressed African people here in America and other oppressed people throughout the world, and speaks into that. Joe Biden, who just pardoned his son, going all the way back to 2014, and a lot of people don't understand the connection of why he did that. Pardoning his son Hunter, but also pardoning him not now, but crimes even committed back to 2014. Because where was Joe Biden at in 2014? He was the vice president under Barack Obama. What else happened in 2014, folks? The Ukrainians go to their Democratic polls and they elect the president. Obama doesn't like it. Joe Biden doesn't like it, and they overthrow him. And then it's Hunter Biden enters the picture as a front man for selling access into what we see today, which later becomes one of the first moves that Joe Biden makes when he becomes president, and that is to go to war with Ukraine. All of this is connected. The hypocrisy of Omali Yeshitela going to Russia to make speeches, which he has every right to do, and then getting labeled an agent of the Russian government. It's just, you can't make this stuff up. But again, when we bring this case to the masses of the people, they just like, yeah, you know, but this is big stuff. What do you think about that?
I mean, think about it from the angle of like the Democratic Party in general. I feel like anytime things don't go their way, they say, well, that's because of Russian propaganda. That's because Russia is, you know, like basically getting in between us and our voters through social media. It's basically because there's Russian trolls that are, swaying the votes. Or even when they had the third party with Jill Stein, the Green Party, they were like, oh, well, she's just a Russian plant. I think anytime that there's any sort of issues or voters have questions, or, the truth is coming out in any capacity, or there's any sort of alternative that would challenge them on the things that they say that they stand for, they basically make the common denominator and they just say, hey, everything is just blamed on Russia. And I think what it does is it makes, the population, the American population, hate Russia to the point where when we're like sending millions upon billions of dollars of our taxpayer money, over to Ukraine to fight this entity per se, people think it's justified because they think it's like this huge threat.
Yeah. So, Brother Satch, who was part of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s, he said that we're not here to overthrow the government. And that's basically what they're trying to convince themselves that Omali Yeshitela was over in Russia trying to do. But Brother Satch said, we're not here to overthrow the government. We're simply here to heighten the contradictions, right? And so the contradiction of democratic power politics is that that the Democrats and the Republicans are actually different. But they are on the same team, is what we preach. And what do you mean when I say that, Brother Malik? Is that let's stay with this theme of Omali Yeshitela. In the 19 teens, in the 1920s, there was a launch by a government agency by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, a program called the Counterintelligence Program, where he would go after Black leaders. Some argue that case number one was the movement of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, where he was deported and his movement broke. He had the largest movement in the history to this day of Black people. He had over 60% of all Black people on his rolls. At a time when we had 14 million people, Black people in the population of the United States, he had 8 million across this country, including Malcolm's father, who ran his chapter in Omaha, Nebraska, literally on his rolls of the United Negro Improvement Association. It was the FBI, and with the help of the Black petty bourgeoisie under a movement called the Garvey Must Go movement, who caused his deportation and the breaking of that movement. There's some argue, like the late scholar Dr. Conrad Worrell, that the first victim of the FBI's counterintelligence program was not Garvey, that it was actually a Black woman by the name of Sister Callie House, who in the late 19th century and the early part of the 1900s, 20th century, she launched a program seeking reparations for Black people. And she was jailed for that. All right, jailed for 1 year for actually calling for reparations for Black people or ex-slaves. Now, here's the contradiction. The contradiction is that the counterintelligence program fades from the 1920s through the 30s. We're talking presidents like, Coolidge and Hoover and Roosevelt, Eisenhower, the Kennedys, all the way to Johnson and Ford, and then President Carter, who, oh, by the way, passed away today at 100 years old. It fades all the way through the Reagan administration and the Bush administration and the Clinton administration in the 90s, and then the another Bush administration, then the Obama administration is still here today, meaning that they're on the same team. They don't care whether they're Democrats or Republicans. One point that I want to make, as I talked about this uniparty, and that the empire is on the same team to protect their interests here and abroad, is that under the Obama administration, when he was lame duck in his second term, he makes a trip with Eric Holder, the first Black attorney general, top cop, to Havana, Cuba. Prior to that, when he names Eric Holder years before as the AG, he within weeks puts Assata Shakur, a Muslim, a freedom fighter who has taken up a cover under the Castro Revolution and the Cuban Revolution since the 1980s. He puts her as FBI most wanted, number one on the list. A Black AG does this. The first Black AG in the history of the contradictions. So as Obama leaves office, he takes a trip to Havana Square to do what? Make a speech? No. He's down there because there's an advanced team of the CIA and Secret Service who go down 2 weeks before, knocking on doors, tapping phones, cell towers, the works, looking for who? Assata Shakur. And he doesn't find her, right? The Cuban government made it clear, hands off Assata Shakur. We're not turning her over to you. And that's the end of that story. The contradiction is what I'm talking about. That here's a president who is Black, a Democrat who is carrying out the same policies of the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, that assassinated Black leaders, infiltrated Black organizations. We already talked about Garvey. In the 1960s, they infiltrated the Nation of Islam with assets and agents, turning the leadership and Malcolm X against each other, right? Which led to Malcolm's assassination. Then in 1966, the Black Panther Party originates, and they go after them with everything they have, assassinating their leaders, infiltrating their organizations. This goes across Republicans and Democrats. They're on the same team, and that team is to protect the empire. Vote for me, and I'll set you free, is what they say. What do you think about that?
I mean, let's take into account just what we saw with Harris, right? When she was running, everyone expected her to say, hey, I'm going to be completely different than Biden. And she admitted, I'm going to be just like him. There will be no significant changes. And then she was just like, hey, we're nothing like Republicans. We're X, Y, and Z. We want to give freedom. But then she's like endorsed by Dick Cheney and is really proud of it. And she was also actually endorsed by, I think it was the staffers of Reagan, who was also a Republican, also very proud of it. So when she engaged in this Cheneyism per se, I think it was basically admitting that, hey, this is the guy who orchestrated the entire Iraq war, but he's endorsing me. And guys, this is a good thing. The second thing that I think she said that was very interesting was when Trump was basically going after like liberals and Democrats and progressives and saying, hey, they're all crazy, we want nothing to do with them. I think Kamala Harris trying to appeal to maybe like liberal Republicans, excuse me, or the moderates or the centrists, if you will. She was basically saying, hey, Republicans will have a seat at our table. We need to work together, X, Y, and Z. And the reason I'm pointing out all of these bullet points per se is because she was essentially admitting to everyone's faces that the liberal Democrats are really no different than the quote unquote conservative Republicans. They may have one or two I guess you could say like issues where they're like, hey, we disagree on it, so please be pro-gun or anti-gun, or pro-abortion or anti-abortion. But I think that's to make people fight amongst themselves. When it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to economics, when it comes to taxes, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to literally liberating people, I think that they align in each and every single way. And any differences they have aren't like, integral differences to basically advocate for people. That's basically to create sort of a conquer and divide narrative. Because as long as we have people on one end of the spectrum saying, hey, we advocate for, minorities and women's rights, and thus this party is better. And then we have another party that's essentially like, no, we don't care. People are basically blinded by what policies are actually coming out, which is marginalizing the entire spectrum, especially both sides of it.
Yeah. So you're listening to the Muslim Street, MuslimStreet.com. You can find us there and across all platforms. This is our weekly podcast. My name is Malik Aziz, and I'm here with our co-host of the Muslim Street, Hina Lotus. Hina, I had a discussion with someone else who was a victim of the counterintelligence program in the early 1970s under the Black Liberation Army, who struggled with Assata Shakur and Sandiata Kohli and others, Durrell bin Wahad, who was a Muslim. and I asked Durrell a question I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to tell you his answer. I want you to kind of flow with that discussion. So I talked to him about the rise of the left in America. The robot said, "What left you talking about?" so I went, and this happened. I think that discussion I had with him maybe about a month and a half ago. So it was post election here in the United States. And one of the things that I think that he and I definitely agreed on, he's one of my mentors, is that if you look at the warring that has been going on against the Muslims since 1990, the United States government, once in 1989, we saw the fall of the Soviet Union. It needed another quote unquote virtual enemy in order to feed the coffers of the military industrial complex. That's just the way that works. They chose Islam as their new enemy. This was clear. Now, where since then to the present, as we see the genocide that's going on in Gaza. And I think what he was talking about is like, where's the anti-war movement in this country amongst the left? They're nowhere to be found. I'll let you respond.
I mean, I don't disagree with them in any capacity, and I'll tell you why. The left does exist, but the problem is I think they're so stuck on like the academic side, the theory side, the conjecture. It's a lot of talk, but no action. And I think without the action, the left only then exists on a theoretical level, because a lot of, being part of the left, being a leftist, a progressive, a socialist, a communist. I mean, there's a multitude of like names for it, right? If you belong to that end of the spectrum, it means that you are out there and you're organizing and you're resisting and you're boycotting and you are actively doing everything you can to dismantle the empire. And we can all talk about revolution, right? It sounds like a beautiful idea, but I think everyone is waiting for another person to initiate it and then everyone else follow through. And that's the problem. I think when you're a part of the left, you can't wait for another leader. You yourself as an individual are a leader. We need to be collective leaders. So in a way, I guess I disagree with them. There is a left, but that left is theoretical at the moment because it's all bark and no bite. And we need that bite to truly exist and make a change.
Yeah. So again, you heard me mention earlier about today the passing of at 100 years old, former President Jimmy Carter. One thing I would say about Jimmy Carter, excusing his presidency, which he saw inflation go to about 18 or 19%. So no way he was going to be more than a one-term president. He got played on the Iranian thing, which kind of introduced the spectacle of what is known as Charlie Wilson's War. We could have a very interesting conversation about that post Jimmy Carter. Also, he had some very nefarious characters part of his State Department, people like Zygmunt Brzezinski, whose daughter is on MSNBC, Mika Brzezinski, who sought to build a wedge between the Black struggle in the United States and the African continent, a stated policy. Later, Jimmy Carter, you can pull up his conversations as it relates to the Palestinians. He was sound as militant as us, even though, excusing, that a lot of bark and no bite on that accords that he attempted to put together. Later, he calls out the oppression of the Palestinians, and he's very critical of not only Benjamin Netanyahu, but the Zionist government. They will always stop short of reaching toward a general solution there. But I would say that he did have some stronger talking points. And also about free elections, particularly in Africa, and the free election that happened in 2005 in Palestine, where they elected Hamas. Jimmy Carter said that was a clean election. Hillary Clinton and others, had other ideas, and they called for those elections to be ignored and their own leaders put in, and Hamas being removed. So again, Jimmy Carter passes away, former president of the United States at 100 years old. Again, Hina, as we talk about this uniparty and the failure of democratic power politics as a tool for oppressed people to use, some will say, and you've heard this, well, what about the local elections? Your congressmen and your congresswoman and judges, and vote for them, and put your people in on the local level. My response, and I'd like for you to chime in on this, the Congressional Black Caucus as a case study. Those are Black members of the House of Representatives, and Cory Booker, the senator, and Tim Scott, another senator, all belong to the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus votes on the side of the Zionist state. The Congressional Black Caucus hasn't even been able to raise a discussion around reparations for 310 years of free labor, also known as slavery. Nothing, right? The Congressional Black Caucus, if you go back to the 1994 Biden architect crime bill, the Clinton crime bill, a lot of them voted for that bill, even at the behest of their Black petty bourgeoisie leader who had access to Clinton's White House, and that's Reverend Jesse Jackson, had total access to that White House. He was against it. Again, the fallacy of this whole structure of the House of Representatives, and you can see Rashida Tlaib, just poor Rashida. What do you think?
Well, I think you make some really good points. And I think one thing that people really need to understand about local politics, state level politics, or even when you look at it on a national level, is people only get as far as they do when it comes to these elections, only because they are basically agents of, the empire. So for example, when people say, oh, well, this is an African American woman, or this is an Arab woman, or this is, a Black man or Hispanic person, or, whatever the case may be, they think, okay, due to identity politics, I believe that because we're the same, gender, we're the same socioeconomic class, we are the same color, we're the same race, ethnicity, they will have my best interest at heart. But the only reason that that individual made it as far as they did is because they were basically oppressing people who looked just like them. Because if they were not oppressing people just like them and they weren't agents of empire, they wouldn't have made it that far. So, to be candid, I actually trust people in those positions much less because I think to myself, well, obviously, someone who's the exact opposite of me, right? A white man will have no issue oppressing someone who looks like me. But if there's a woman who looks exactly like me that made it to the level that she did in state government, local government, national government, she had to have not just gone after other minorities, but she had to have oppressed people who looked just like her, went through the same struggles as her, identify with her on a multitude of levels. That's someone you trust less, to be completely honest. So I think we need to stop thinking in terms of elections. We need to start thinking in terms of, okay, lesser of two evils. We need to stop thinking in terms of, well, as long as we get someone from our religion or our background, our ethnicity, our gender, someone who has like the same issues that we have and they want to advocate for it, that person doesn't necessarily, stand for what we do. If anything, I think they're just, they have great PR. They're saying what they need to get the vote. But once they get these votes and they, have this position of power, they do everything they can to continue oppressing people who, at the very end of the day, look just like them. So identity politics is, I think, a very neoliberal construct. They basically say, hey, look, we're advocating for Black people because, hey, we have Black people on our team. We're advocating for women's rights because look at all these women that we have as candidates for president or governor or whatever the case may be. I think it's all a ploy. It's a ploy to get the vote. You look at someone who looks just like you and you think, okay, like this is a step in the right direction. But you can't sit there and vote based on essentially another neoliberal construct, affirmative action. You have to, base it on policy. And someone who shares the same policies we do is never going to make it to that level. We have to resist, we have to organize, and we have to do it outside of this whole election construct. We're not going to find any sort of advocacy for ourselves, or we're not going to be able to, find any sort of justice or freedom for ourselves, at the hands of people, whether they look like us or not, whether they align with one party or the other. They just do not have our best interests at heart. So to think independently, to be a free thinker, to organize and to, think of ways to dismantle the system altogether is, I think, our only hope. And the way that I look at it is I hope the Muslim world wakes up to that because there's brothers and sisters from our ummah suffering all over the world as a byproduct of the people that we voted for thinking that they would give us freedom. Not only did they not give us freedom, but now they are killing our brothers and sisters, all across the globe, especially in the global south, with our taxpayer money. And if that's something that we consider freedom or the lesser of the two evils, I think there's a lot of thought that we need to engage in, and we need to have further discussions on what we, define as freedom. Because if freedom to you is our taxpayer money going into everything but infrastructure and the advocacy of ourselves, and it's being used to kill people all around the world, especially part of our ummah, then that is not freedom. That is actually further oppression.
Yeah. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett out of Texas, she faced down Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was a racist, over, this, that, and the other. And she was hiding somewhere around last spring, last spring, March timeframe. She was hiding as this very visible Black political leader because of that. Then, as the campaign for the presidency heats up, she was asked a question about as she was raised to the national level. She was asked a question, and I never forget it. She said, and I want you to comment on it. She said, the question was asked to her, now would you go on the national stage with your popularity and stump for Joe Biden? And she said that the Biden campaign had already reached out to her to go up to Michigan and tell those Muslims that they should be voting for Joe Biden, that Donald Trump was going to, enforce that Muslim ban again. Yeah, and she went into this little diatribe. I was so insulted by the ignorance behind all that. I mean, it's like, the reason why they're sending you up there is what you should be addressing, and that is the genocide that's going on of the Muslims in Gaza. Again, can you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, but this is the thing because I had a lot of people come up to me and say something very similar, right? Oh, if Trump comes back into power, then we're going to have the Muslim ban again. So basically, what you're saying is banning Muslims, potentially banning Muslims from other countries coming into, the United States is a bigger threat than all of our taxpayer money going into genocide. I'm not saying that I, endorse the Muslim ban or I think it's a positive thing. It's absolutely terrible. But banning individuals from coming into this country is very different than killing, I think, 200,000 people in Gaza with, I don't even want to call it a war. It's not a war. I think that's a very propaganda sort of way of looking at it. But essentially, it's a genocide going on over there that we are funding. We're watching live streamed. And for people to sit there and prioritize the Muslim ban potentially happening over that is insane. Because at the end of the day, when Trump hasn't come back into power yet, we saw what he did during his first term. We don't know what he will make good on and won't on his second term. It could be better, it could be worse, but I think we will have to. It's better to gamble on that than look at what the current administration is doing and say, yes, it's very likely they're going to continue doing this, if not worse. And I still somehow think it's better than what Trump could theoretically do, right? And so there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that I think went on in terms of our community. And I think the Muslim community overall realizes that, hey, regardless of who comes into power, we're going to be oppressed, we're going to be marginalized. So we have to, select the lesser of the two evils. They're both evil. People are going to suffer, people are going to die, people are going to be oppressed, people are going to have, their freedoms further taken away if they ever had them to begin with. And so we need to think outside of this narrative by thinking like, hey, if I vote for this party, I am doing my due diligence by bringing justice to this world. You are voting for basically your further oppression and that of others. So I think when it comes to, national politics in the United States, we have to realize that we cannot fall for CNN and Rachel, Maddow talking points. We can't sit there and listen to MSNBC. We can't sit there and listen to Fox News and say, you know what, these people have a point. They have my best interests at heart. And thus I should vote in the way that they're telling me to because they're state sponsored. The government is only going to allow them to say certain things that basically uphold like the corporations. It upholds the lobbyists. It upholds, the politicians in power, and it upholds the capitalists and the imperialists.
Yeah.
Anything that defies that and is good for the people, the 99% that is suffering, is something they will never tell us. And
Yeah.
so any talking points that they have advocate for empire, and empire is the enemy.
Yes. So we got about just a few minutes left. I'll wind down. I got one more question I want to raise and have you respond to. Before I get that, just to correct something, I couldn't come up with the term earlier as I talked about President Carter during his administration. It was the Camp David Accords that he put together. He had Menachem Begin, the president of Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat. Anyhow, the last question. Kamala Harris, in 100 days, ran through an estimate $2 billion. Donald Trump, hundreds of millions of dollars. That money didn't come from poor working class people, the oppressed people in this country. They're trying to pay their light bill. They're trying to, put food on the table. So, speak and close this program out on as we talk about the contradiction of Democratic power politics and then the money that came into that campaign. $2 billion that she ran through in 100 days.
And she ended up in debt.
Yeah. She raised more money than Obama did in 08 and 12. There was a portion, even coming from the white left. No, not even the white left. I'm not even call them leftists. That there are 300 white men who run this country, and we can talk about that and go into depth on that and come to some very good clarity on another show. But you can best understand that that $2 billion didn't come from anybody other than those people. And let's close it out on that.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when it comes to our taxpayer money, and even the donations that we make, we have to understand that all the money that went to Kamala Harris, she utilized it for concerts, right? A bunch of people that just, celebrities who don't represent us in any regard, regardless of their race or talent. And she used it for a bunch of, just PR and kind of showing that she was cool and different. And she went on very questionable podcasts. And from my understanding, she was invited to a podcast that wanted to do it for free. And she said, no, that's okay. I'm trying to separate myself from Trump. And I think she was afraid of people asking her hard hitting questions because a lot of what she was saying was essentially word vomit. But I think at the end of the day, all that money was wasted. Not only did she not win, but she lost by a Democrat in 20 years, especially when it comes to popular vote. So I don't know. At the end
Yeah.
of the day, we just need to wake up.
Thanks for an engaging conversation. You've been listening to the Listen to Me podcast. Find us on www.com. Share, subscribe, on that Twitter. Again, we'll see you guys next week. Struggle hard. Also, keep going. And what happened again? Talk about that's rocket. We'll see you guys next week. I'm like.